Good evening. My name is Fred Rutberg, and I am the publisher of Berkshire Eagle. And I'm proud to welcome you to this, the third in a series of 4 conversations Berkshire Eagle and the Berkshire Taconic Community Foundation have put together with the help and sponsorship of Berkshire Bank. Without the bank, this conversation series would not occur. This conversation series came from Berkshire Eagle request to the community back before the 2020 election. We asked people, we said to our readers that we expected that whoever won the election, the country would need healing. We asked people to write in what kind of suggestions they could make to heal the Berkshires. That led Peter Taylor, who's the president and CEO of Berkshire Taconic, whom you'll hear at the end of the evening, get in touch with me and suggest that we do something, put together a program. And we have a series of 4 talks, all centered around the concept of bridging divides. And tonight's talk is Bridging Divides, how modern media can both create and bridge divides. I am really pleased and proud to tell you that and introduce you to our 2 panelists tonight. First, we have Alec McGillis, who covers politics for ProPublica. Alex has previously reported for the New Republic, the Washington Post, and the Baltimore Sun. He won the 2016 Robin Toner Prize for Excellence in Political Reporting, the 2017 Polk Award for National Reporting, and the 2017 Elijah Parrish Lovejoy Award. His work has appeared everywhere: the New Yorker, Atlantic, New York Magazine, Harper's, New York Times magazines, just to name a few. Closer to home, Alec was born and raised in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. He's a member of the famous PHS class of '92. He now resides in Baltimore and is the author of the book, The Cynic, a 2014 biography of Senator Mitch McConnell. His most recent book, though, is Fulfillment. And I have a copy right here to show you. It just came out a couple of weeks ago, and it's the title is Fulfillment: Winning and Losing in One-Click America. And he investigates Amazon's impact on wealth and poverty in towns and cities across the United States. It has been named a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice Award and called, quote, grounded and expansive examination of the American economic divide by the Los Angeles Times. And I am just so pleased that Alec to be part of it. He's obviously, his dad was a former executive editor of this paper, and he's been part of the Berkshire Eagle family since he was born. And it's a great pleasure to introduce and welcome Alec McGillis to talk tonight. And joining Alec in this talk is someone who, Charles M. Sennett, who is the founder of the Ground Truth Project site. Charlie was the founder, chief executive officer, is the founder, chief executive officer, and editor of the Ground Truth Project. He's an award-winning correspondent, a best-selling author, and an editor with 30 years experience in national, international, and local journalism. He has reported from the front lines of wars and insurgencies from at least 20 different nations, including the post-9/11 conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the 2011 Arab Spring. His deep experience in reporting has led him to dedicate himself to supporting and training the next generation of journalists so that they can tell the most important stories of our time. Charlie is also the co-founder of Global Post, an acclaimed international news website. A leading social entrepreneur in the new media, he has started the Ground Truth in 2014, and then in 2017, he launched that nonprofit's new local reporting initiative Report for America. He's an alumnus of the Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. He's a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. In 2016, Charlie was accepted into the DRK portfolio of the most effective social entrepreneurs in the nonprofit sector. And he too has a Berkshire connection because we in the Berkshire Eagle have been the proud recipient of a Report for America reporter. Danny Ginn has been with us for almost a year. And Report for America has been kind enough not only to extend his term with us for yet another year, but they've awarded us a second Report for America reporter who just is about to be hired, so I can't mention her name until it's all sealed, signed, sealed, delivered. But she will be a data trends reporter, and that's a beat that was unknown to people like me when we were growing up. But she will take information about governments and institutions and convey that to other reporters to help them increase their ability. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce you all to Alec McGillis and Charlie Sennett. Now, to start off, guys, how will tomorrow's decision from Facebook's oversight board on whether or not to reinstate Donald Trump's account, in your estimation, either deepen divides in our country or perhaps make a move towards helping heal those divides? Alec, you have any thoughts on that?
Oof. Boy, I have to admit, I've been so busy with fulfillment and my day job that I haven't had too much time to focus on that particular decision. Other than to say that the one cannot overstate the extent to which Facebook has in fact sort of taken over the media landscape. What I saw in 2016 as a reporter who was out as Trump was rising across the country, and as we saw the Trump phenomenon starting to happen in early 2016, I picked up on it very early in 2016 in Ohio, where I was spending a lot of time as a reporter. And what you saw there was just how many people far from the coast, far from the what we think of as sort of the digital media capitals, had come to rely on Facebook for so much of their news, everything, their entire picture of the world coming from Facebook as other forms of media kind of collapsed around them. And so I would be going door to door talking to people in these small, cities of Southwest Ohio, outside Dayton, Miamisburg, Ohio, other communities like that, speaking to a heavy construction worker, a woman who did heavy construction machinery work, and who you start talking to her, very likable, intelligent person. You start talking with her about what she cared about and the issues she cared about. She was an Obama voter, and she would quickly just go into this rabbit hole, this tunnel that was all this miasma of stuff she had gotten from Facebook, which was really her only source of information. All this Benghazi stuff, this Hillary email stuff that she had found in her sincere attempts to find information, she had gone down these rabbit holes, and because there was nothing else that she was getting, it was all Facebook, and I saw that again and again and again, and it was so much a part of the story of his rise. And so it's possible that now we're at the point where he's irrelevant enough that this is somewhat of a kind of a horse out the barn door kind of question, but I would just say in general that Trump and Facebook is the story of his having been visited upon us is so completely inextricably linked with the story of that company and the way that it filled the void that had been created by the collapse of traditional news.
Charlie,
well, first of all, I guess I'm really glad you asked Alec this question first, because it gave me a little bit of time to think about it. Good evening, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here. Fred, thanks for convening this really, truly important conversation. I'll dive right in on this one, which is the fact that we're all sort of on the edge of our seat about this decision, I think really reveals that Facebook has too much power to be able to make a decision about whether or not a former president of the United States will have access to a platform that wields that much of an audience, puts them in a position that I'm not sure anyone should really have. That said, I would also hasten to add that Facebook's power is clumsy and it's proven to very often be toxic. But I've also seen it be a force for good. I was in Tahrir Square in Egypt, and I watched young people convene for those of you who remember, the Arab Spring was called the Facebook Revolution at one point. And we watched the power of that platform to pull people together to express themselves against a police state under Hosni Mubarak in Egypt and rise up against that police state and topple Hosni Mubarak. That was an amazing moment of history that I think was a glimpse of the good that can come out of a platform that powerful. I think cut to our own uprising here in the United States at the Capitol on January 6th, and you saw sort of the horrifying image of the negative impact that I think social media has had on dividing our country, and how a very cynical use of that media by the former president to really use it to circumvent the filters of the press and of journalists, to take a message that was divisive and didn't reflect our values, but be able to bring that straight to the American people unfiltered, and it caused damage. So I look at this as a very complex decision. I also think Facebook has a chance, a responsibility, I might add, to be part of repairing the ravages they've left behind of local news. You know, one of the big problems with the crisis in local news, which I know we're going to talk about, is the business model has fallen apart. Different estimates on this, but approximately 70 cents of every digital advertising dollar goes to either Google or Facebook. That's what's killing local news in America. And that's what's really hurting a lot of the great news organizations we love that can't use the same business models they have in the past to successfully build their organizations. And I think Facebook has an opportunity to help. And I want to say they are helping. Facebook is providing a lot of funding for a lot of new initiatives. I think they get it, that they're going to have to be part of solving this crisis too. They support a lot of local news initiatives, including our own. So we make sure they are never the majority of our funding or our largest funder. We don't cover technology because we don't want to be seen as in a conflict position. But look, Facebook is a force to reckon with, and we have to, as journalists, just continue to recognize both the power for good and the power for ill, and make sure we hold them accountable.
Well, if Facebook is as powerful as both of you say it is, and we all kind of know it, and certainly I personally feel the pain of what Facebook and Google has done to the world of advertising, even though I got into it after all the damage had already been done, but we keep hearing about it every day. How can they then have the power to should they be allowed to deplatform somebody? On one hand, you say Trump used this to get directly to the public. Is it the public square? Is it the town? Is it the new town square? And what kind of regulations, if any, should be on the new town square? Either of you?
I would follow on what Charlie said about how it's simply not right to have this much power in one hand, and that this is why this coming debate in Washington about the power of these companies is so important. We are embarking right now in a really remarkable moment in Washington, where there are going to be serious efforts brought both by Congress and by the various agencies to reckon with this dominance, this power, and the size of these companies. And one of the possible solutions, there are different ways of going about it. One would be to somehow break them up. The one counter to the break them up approach is that simply wouldn't work, that we've gotten to the point where they permeate in such a way that it's somehow not workable to break them up, that Facebook's role as a social media fact, reality in Americans' lives, is somehow you couldn't just disassemble it. And so then at that point, one starts to think about the other possibility is to go the route of what's called, essentially the common carrier route, where we come to accept these giants as facts of our life that need heavy regulation, where it becomes essentially like the railroads or other sort of utilities essentially that we rely on that are going to be big by nature of their type, but because we're allowing them to be so big, they're going to have just an incredible amount of regulation to the point where we're almost treating them as quasi-public things. And that's another possibility. But this is all now this is one of the most important debates we've had in a long time in Washington. It's about to launch on various fronts, and the stakes are so big. And it also includes not just this sort of media aspect of things, the Google and Facebooks, but also includes the Amazons, where you have the same issues with platforms that have become so big and powerful, but you're not really sure how you'd even go about breaking them up.
Yeah, well, I think that Facebook is a natural monopoly, and that's what Alec is talking about. That when he compares it to a railroad or the telephone company back when you and I were growing up, when there was just one telephone company. I mean, it could be a natural monopoly because the public uses it so widely.
If that's directed to me, Alec, I would say I think Google and Facebook are a duopoly. I think we've seen the power of what sort of what happened with Standard Oil is happening in some ways with these big platforms that I think we have to be thoughtful in how we do a check and balance on this. We can look around the world to see good examples. Australia has really challenged Facebook in some deep ways. Europe is also doing it, and publishers are pushing back. And they're saying that we create the content that you deploy, in the case of Google through the algorithm, and in the case of Facebook through paid advertising, to try to create huge revenue for these companies that really comes off the backs of hardworking news organizations that put content out into the world, the basis upon which they've built their empires. And I think there is a fair pushback on that. And we're going to see this is a time of great ferment. And as I say, there is tremendous force for good, and there is really serious concerns about the toxicity of these platforms as well. I think we're in a moment that's a defining moment. It's other times in history you could go back to could be like, even in the 1930s when they started to think about the power of, should it be public radio or should there be a commercially driven broadcast network in America? And then you go fast forward in the late 60s in America, the Great Society, there was a real push to create more educational television. PBS and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting were born under the Great Society in 1967. I think we're in a moment now where we're going to have to create sort of new corporations for public media, and it's going to have to be more digital. And I think we're going to have to lean into this to call upon those who've amassed such extraordinary fortunes to say, you're going to have to play a role in a recreation and a restoration of local news in America, because the crisis in local news that is a business crisis first, and a crisis, and I would say, just to be tough on our tribe here, I think journalism has failed in many important ways that we need to reflect on and answer for. It's not just a business problem, it's also a problem of the soul of journalism, that we need to be better at our jobs. We need to think about making sure we are out there listening to people who don't feel heard in this country. But I think we also have to just sort of embrace this idea that we need to recognize that the crisis in local journalism in America has become a crisis for our democracy. The two are connected. And for journalists, we're storytellers, but we're not doing a good job telling our own story. This is a crisis with an enormity and magnitude of the collapse of the steel industry, or any other collapse of a very important industry, except I would argue this one, local journalism in America, that collapse is far more important, because it goes right into the foundation of our democracy. It's built upon a free press. And when that foundation begins to erode, then truth begins to erode. And we see very clearly now, after January 6th and the attack on the Capitol, that this has really become, faster than I ever thought it would happen, a true battle for our democracy. And I think local news is right in the center of the debate, and the place where we need to begin to restore our democracy through the service of local news, which, Fred, I really mean this, like, hats off to you, to the Berkshire Eagle. I love your newspaper. It is one of America's great papers. And I feel like the models you've done around innovations in business and pushing forward, your community needs to know you guys are innovators, you're pioneers, and you're fighting the good fight. And it's a fight people need to understand. The stakes are very high. And I think the stakes really, truly are as high as our democracy.
Charlie, I thank you for that. Valentine to the Berkshire Eagle. I really appreciate it. And oh, by the way, I'm not the best host, I guess. I forgot to tell people, if you have questions, at the bottom of there's some icons at the bottom of your screen, at the top, depending on what carrier you're using. There's a Q&A. You can put your questions in the Q&A. There are a bunch of questions that come through in the chat. That's okay too, but it'll be better if they come through in the Q&A. But Alec, Charlie says that our democracy is being threatened because of the challenges to local news. What is local news? What is our responsibility here? I just read something this afternoon that floored me, and that's a survey, a recent survey from Reuters, Ipsos. It said that 60% of Republican voters believe that the election was stolen because of widespread fraud. Yet there's not one bit of credible evidence of that. I mean, how do we tell? Are we not telling the right story? Are we not speaking the right language? Do we require new language? I mean, this is something for you guys. You have a thought, Alex?
I have a lot of thoughts on this. I would just say though that I don't believe that local news is responsible for that kind of misinformation and that kind of the allowance of that kind of a lie to flourish. I believe that it's the absence of local news that has turned people instead not just to Facebook but to national, highly polarized national kind of outlets that has created that kind of a completely false, ridiculous notion. It's the fact that people are not even reading you at all and have no connection with you at all. And I think that's less likely in a place like Berkshire's, where you still have a now revitalized local newspaper and a somewhat healthier local media market. But it's the places where there's no connection at all, to where there's just nobody even knows anything about the local paper. Like, it's simply not visible. It's not on anyone's step. It's not barely anyone's logging into it. It's not that they're getting somehow a misimpression of what happened in the election from their local paper. It's that they're just completely cut off from it. And so that's what then brings you to the in that void, they turn somehow gravitated to this a world that's on a separate plane in a sense. And that's not to say that there's nothing that you can do. I think that anything that local news can do to build confidence in itself as an institution by being out there talking to people, being active, being decent reporters, every single decent interaction between a reporter and a citizen is good for the media in general, because it builds confidence in traditional media. So that you can do, and that counts for so much. What I found so often when I was out there is people who you'd approach them as a reporter, and it'd be as if you're approaching them as a space alien. Like, they have no concept of any kind of, the notion of a newspaper reporter is completely utterly foreign. They're gone from where they are. They have no experience of it. They don't see anyone anymore at the school board. They don't see anyone at the court. They don't see anyone at City Hall. So their only notion of the media is that fancy guy who some bloviator on TV who maybe in election season he comes to town and it's a big deal. The bloviator's there and it's a nice suit with fancy glasses, but that's their only experience of it. It's a sort of celebrity notion of the media. They have no other experience of it. So to the extent that your reporters are out actually being very active in town, really talking to people, very present, even if it has nothing to do with the election, that in itself is rebuilding the faith in the trust somewhat.
Could I jump in on that,
Yeah,
Fred?
please,
Just for a second? I really agree with you, Alec. I think this idea that the journalists, local reporters who are out in the communities are the ambassadors of the importance of local journalism to our democracy. And, there's a great question in the chat here from Suzette Masters about sort of what is it about journalism, local journalism, that can insulate communities from toxic polarization? I'd love to try to answer that question in relation to what Alec was just saying. So look, here's what we know. Here's what we know happens when news organizations die, when news deserts develop, as we call them, across the country. We know now that there are 2,000 communities in America where they no longer have a local news organization. So imagine the Berkshires without the Berkshire Eagle. Like that is not a pretty thought. That's a thought where the shared stories of accountability, the watchdog role, but also the stories of heroes and interesting local stories, the stories that bind the community together. When they go, people don't have that binding agent anymore. And where do they go? They go to national media, they go to cable television, and they end up on maybe MSNBC or maybe Fox or somewhere in between, but they end up in an environment that pulls us apart. So we know 3 things happen. There's good data on this. 3 things happen in a news desert. 1, voter participation decreases steadily and then dramatically. 2, polarization increases precipitously. It rockets in an environment where there's no local information that people can trust. And I think the third and maybe the most interesting, or the one that surprised me the most, was bond ratings drop in communities that don't have a local news organization because banks are smart enough to not put an investment into a place where no one's watching the store. So the health of a community has a direct relationship to the health of its local news organization. And we need to get out there and tell this story much better than we have as journalists if we're going to convince people. So we are now in the business of inspiring a new generation. This is what I do now, right? So Report for America, if I can, I just want to tell you what that program is. We have 300 reporters in 200 newsrooms across the country. And we really work with newspapers we trust, newspapers, digital news organizations, public radio stations, places that have a public service mission, like the Berkshire Eagle. We're really proud to support them. And what that support means is we say to the editor and publisher, we say, convince us that there's a part of your community that you feel you could cover better and that you want to cover better. When you present that to us, and then show us that you have a good mentoring and editing network that will support this emerging journalist so we can bring a new journalist along and help really fuel the pipeline for growth of a new generation called to the service of local journalism. When you get that, we then go to the reporters and we get flooded with applications. Our program has become now like statistically, it's about where Princeton is in terms of admissions. 2,000 applications for 120 slots. And I just came off the call where we were welcoming the new corps members who we've just brought in. And they are just so talented, so excited to be on a journey and an adventure to go serve a local community. About 2/3 of them are not from the communities they'll serve. So we're also giving people in our country a chance to see other corners of the country and meet other people and connect. About 1/3 are from their local communities, and we're proud of that too. We love that they're there, they're from there, and they're going to serve their community. We pay half the salary. We put the newsroom on the hook for the other half, but we help them raise that money by giving them some ideas around how to do community fundraising, et cetera. So this is really a service organization. This is Teach for America or the Peace Corps but for journalism. This is saying we need to create a new core that will go out and really think about journalism as public service. So I'm not trying to pitch Report for America, but I think it's an important part of the solution for this crisis we're talking about in local news.
Well, I'll pitch for Report for America. We give some money to the Berkshire Eagle because we need to raise them. I got a question here that follows up on where you guys were just talking, because you said that when I asked about the threat to democracy, you said it's more of a national thing, not a problem for local news. But a friend of mine writes in that, how do you view the incursion of companies like Sinclair into local news venues as an equivalent or an analogous threat to honest, local and truthful news? And that's real here because we have a Sinclair station, a local news TV station that was bought by Sinclair. And when they did that business where they all had to parrot, read, it was like reading from Chairman Mao's book. They did it in our neighborhood as well. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I do. Sinclair is actually, this hits close to home for me. Sinclair is based right here in Baltimore. It's based in the suburbs of Baltimore. It's actually sort of sadly and tellingly, it's occasionally the only Fortune 500 company left in Baltimore. Sometimes it's in, sometimes it's out, is Sinclair News and Sinclair Broadcast. And for those who are not aware, it's this large network of local TV stations owned by this very, very conservative company that has many of its reporters are straight news reporters and are doing their best with this very difficult ownership, but they're constantly being forced to tilt things a certain way or to put actual sort of must-run segments into the news, often real kind of wackadoodle stuff, very stuff that makes almost Fox News seem pretty mild by comparison. And they pop up in my book as well because they own a station in Seattle, and they ran an extraordinary hour-long documentary in Seattle on their station there about the homelessness crisis in Seattle that was very powerful in a propagandistic sort of way. It was an incredibly arresting kind of show that would not have appeared on a traditional kind of station, and it had a huge kind of toxic effect in town there. So yes, this is we should be careful not to idealize all local news. We should also be careful to think about TV news as I think so often these discussions about local news overlook TV news in general. TV news is still the form of local news that so many consumers still do get in some form, more than the print product. And I think there's a tendency, I think, for a lot of us print guys to kind of look down on it, to sort of mock it for its fixation on crime in cities and whatnot. It leads kind of coverage, but in a lot of places it is still. I've noticed this as a reporter, that when I'm looking for information in a given place, so often I actually end up being able to rely only actually on a very, very thin report from local TV reporter that's been put up online alongside whatever clip. And so in a lot of places, they're kind of what we're left with. And so, I do hope, and the same goes for radio too. So I do think that we should make sure that these kind of discussions, take in, even if it's not our thing necessarily, that we consider TV and their resources, their pressure from Sinclair type companies, that we think of that too as part of this landscape.
Some of the other places to really think about, Alec, just to build on what you're saying, completely agree with the assessment, but I would say there's Sinclair Media, which has obvious, really conservative political leanings. Then there's Alden, which is a whole other sort of beast, but equally destructive. And Alden is a venture capital firm that is buying up local newspapers for the real estate, squeezing the last bit of profit it can out of them, firing the staff, gutting the newspapers and moving on to the next one. And it is just leaving a ravaged local news landscape of ghost newsrooms, essentially. And the other thing to worry about, and this is new, and I would say in the Berkshires, this is one to really get your radar up about, and that is there are new Sinclairs emerging from the left. And what really scares me, what really profoundly concerns me as a journalist, like I love the old school idea that we're supposed to tell you, you know, what to think about, but not what to think. I love that idea. I cherish it. I think it's the heart of what we do. And when we start seeing, look what happened to national media. Fox begot MSNBC, which created a polarization. So if we now have Sinclair and that begets a left-wing version of local news that has a left-oriented editorial tilt and strategy and purpose, I worry then we lose this last opportunity we have to really think of local news as the binding agent for our country. This is a place where if we do it right, local news can be free and unencumbered of partisan politics, but try to share sets of facts so that you understand the local issues and you can then come together as a community and decide them. I think that's the first primary building block. It's like where you begin to replant the seed is locally, and that's how we're going to get it back. That's how we can restore journalism from the ground up, as we say.
Well, one of our people watching submitted a question. Is it time that maybe the FCC should revisit fairness doctrine? That's something I grew up with, and
yeah. I just love that Alec takes the really hard questions first. So I'm going to wait, and then no, really seriously, I think you've thought about this a lot, Alec. I'd love to hear your answer. I have a follow-up, but I think this is something that's right in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have the strongest feelings on the fairness doctrine, but I have very strong feelings on what Charlie just said about the polarization problem. I just think that this tonight's debate is not just about democracy, but it's about divides. And I spend so much of my time these days as a reporter basically trying to actually bridge divides and trying to, on various issues, find some kind of a somewhat of nuanced middle ground. And whether it's policing or schools and school opening, all these very, 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 very charged issues. And I have been so dismayed by what has happened now that people are getting their news increasingly from these very polarized national outlets, not only on the right, but also on the left. And I've just become more and more worried about this. And I thought about this a lot late last year. I did a piece. I went out to Texas, West Texas, to New Mexico to do a piece about the worries of youth mental health in the pandemic, and there was a really tragic teen suicide in New Mexico that I went to write about, and I was just stunned by how many times when I would tell people in my world, which is basically sort of a blue metro East Coast world, that I was going out to write about that world. And the town in New Mexico where this happened, where the suicide happened, is an 80% Trump town. I was just stunned by the sort of instant stereotyping that I heard of what I was sure to encounter there, with all those crazy anti-masculine, sort of, wild, selfish folks that were just disregarding everything. But I went out there because I, was curious about what happened, and I spent several very intense days speaking there with everyone, and I was came away just, very impressed, as I always am when I go out to speak with anyone anywhere, by the humanity that I encountered, and the fact that what I found was so completely different than what the stereotype would have led one to expect. So much more nuanced, so much more complex, so much more just textured, and I wrote about it, and and managed to have a very resonant story, ended up resonating across the political spectrum, and I hope managed to bring some of us closer to some kind of common ground on this one front, where we're all dealing and all worrying about our young people in this terrible year. And so, we usually talk about the fairness doctrine issue because we're worried about the rise of right-wing media, and that's the context in which it's usually discussed, the rise of the Rush Limbaughs and how their absolutely toxic effect that they've had. But we are getting the point now where so many of us have ended up in our own bubble in a really, really unhealthy way, and to the point where as we're seeing now with COVID, there are actual epistemological issues on the left, and as far as that issue goes, as far as the understanding of risk and whatnot, and I really hope that people can be aware of that and be constantly thinking about how much they themselves have perhaps fallen prey to that without intending to, but just because of the sort of media bubble in which they've chosen to sort of floated into, and just be constantly checking themselves against those stereotypes. And as one commenter here noted, just be more aware of just the extent to which we have in fact come to stereotype entire swaths of the country, and that this has really now happened to us too, and us meaning sort of a blue liberal inclined, media, traditional media, now drifting left kind of reader and viewer, MSNBC, and so that's why I used to be very worried about the fairness doctrine, because I was more worried about what was happening in the right, and now I'm actually increasingly also worried about what's happening on the left.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, Alex. I agree with that assessment. I think it is important in history to remember it. Man, I hope I'm remembering this accurately, but I'm pretty sure it's in the Reagan era. It's about 86, 87 that the fairness doctrine begins to be disassembled. And then finally there's a Supreme Court decision that rescinds the doctrine. And it was seen as sort of a victory for corporate broadcasting to open up and to not be so beholden to this regulation. And it was, the whole Reagan era of stripping away regulation, but it really did create a Wild West. And out of that really was born Fox News. And then Fox News, as I said, begot MSNBC because we started to pull apart. And the algorithms of Facebook and Google have been like a toxic dumpster fire where you take information, the algorithms of both of those platforms are fueled by disagreement. And so when forces are disagreeing, it rises in the rankings, and then there's more and more traffic on that. And this is, I think, one of the greatest challenges of our time is how are we going to disentangle this? And it's so above my pay grade. I honestly don't know. I really don't know, but I really know in my heart that in local news, there's a place to start. It's sort of like that is where you can try to till the soil, get back to doing the good work, and try to think about change from a very, very local level. It's the only way I can think to do it. So I want to, if it's okay with you, Fred, I wanted to go meta a little bit about some of the global work I've done and some of the same issues we're seeing around the world, because you have an amazing readership in the Berkshires that I think is thinking globally and locally. And everything Alec was just talking about is really happening globally. The divides are really deepening globally on these same lines. Brazil, India, the Philippines, these are places where they have strong national media that's polarized and a collapsing local media market. And as we know in our own country, when the local media landscape becomes ravaged, democracy is withered, and the idea of communities coming together is withered. And that is happening, and you really have a powerful example of this in India right now. Modi has such momentum with this Hindu nationalist party and with a lot of the big media companies that are politically aligned with him. They're very powerful and they have huge reach, enormous audience reach in India. But the smaller local news organizations are really becoming news deserts, serving other districts, other regions of India. And as a result, there's no trusted local information. So when a global pandemic hits, there's so much bad information that's out there. So into the void of local news comes a real toxicity and toxic information, not just misinformation, but often disinformation. And that is starting to really fuel this just tragic intensity of the pandemic surging in India. And I think it happened in a smaller way, but with huge ramifications in our own country. We saw what happens when people don't have those trusted local news sources where they, as you started the conversation, like they don't know a reporter. They don't walk into the supermarket and see someone who they know as their local reporter, who's a good guy or a great woman in the community who's gonna be someone who they trust and who they know will provide good information. That collapse is a global phenomena, and it's creating a global recession in democracy. And it is something to think about. And this is I don't want to go too far astray here, but we just launched a service program that will mirror Report for America. That's Report for the World, and we're trying to inspire India and Nigeria first. I hope Brazil soon to replicate, to sort of franchise this model we're creating, where we hope they'll start their own initiatives now to understand that local reporting is the place where you begin to heal that landscape of journalism, so that you can have a better, more cohesive community and hopefully a more functioning democracy.
I want to pick up on where Alec was a little bit. There's a question that's been in the Q&A that follows what you were saying before about the stereotyping. You were describing the situation out in eastern New Mexico and West Texas, and saying that, well, as soon as Trump was elected, the media rushed to categorize voters, saying the working class did this, the rural voters that brought us Trump, but it obviously is more complicated than that. And so the question comes down to, what can the media do to help everyone understand the true demographics and socioeconomic realities without stereotyping? Because it's so, in this world of polling, especially where we use empirical logic and all driven by computers, the way data processing can handle vast amounts of data, it becomes very attractive to put people in groups. And that just helps, I think, and I'm curious what you think, it drives people further and further into these silos. Do you have any thoughts on that, Al?
Oh, I sure do. I mean, this goes back partly to the fact that this problem goes back partly to the fact that at the national level, while we've had this withering of local journalism, there's been actually, concentration of media in the big cities, in DC, New York, and a few other places, but those are the big ones, DC and New York. And so you end up with this deep disconnect right there, where to the extent that we do still have media, they're in the places that are doing incredibly well. They're increasingly kind of cut off from what's happening out there, whether out there is, a small Appalachian town or inner city Cleveland or wherever it might be, and just ending up with a view and really a lack of connection, a lack of, you might even call it empathy, but a lack of just touch with just all these different communities and types of voters and types of people. And so I believe that it's very important for what sort of the national media that remains, whether it's NPR or The Times or whoever, or ProPublica, to be constantly trying to break out of that bubble. And not just in the easily lampooned like Trump voter and diner thing. The Trump voter and diner thing became a bad joke, because the media had generally so failed in 2016 and the years prior to that, so that they were then desperately trying to sort of compensate after Trump got elected with those kind of drive-by stories. But it's not about the drive-by stories. It's about just really spending serious time there. And maybe that means trying to do a better job of dispersing people around. I mean, I think one of the one small glimmer of upside to this horrible year has been that that in some cases, I think it's actually made it more possible for some reporters to remain out there in some form and be not have to be in the headquarters town, and maybe you'll see some of that dispersal remain. I've been so heartened to see ProPublica now setting up bureaus around the country, hiring more people that are going to be by definition elsewhere than New York, where we're mostly based. And it's so to the extent, so in addition to report, I mean, I still think the main solution is a Report for America kind of approach, where you're actually in the local news organization. That is my preference as the main way to rebuild things. And it's why I'm a huge supporter of theirs. I've loved doing sessions with their reporters. I encourage everyone to go that route. Anyone who's starting out now to go that route, to be out there, and instead of a small cog in a big operation in DC or New York. That's my advice to young journalists, and I talk to them all the time. And but in addition to that, the kind of influential journalists that we're talking about in this question, that to spend as much time there as possible, and to also just be constantly aware of just how much your own view has been shaped by your environment in the thriving city, and just to constantly kind of check against that. But I mean, I have come to really see this, as a national journalist, as a huge mission of mine, just to be as much as possible there, and just to immerse and to somehow get word of what's there to back to the bubble.
Charlie, I'm sure you agree with Alex's belief that the RFA is the way to start.
I think it's a trusted old school way of thinking about start local, and I used to say, learn how to get lied to locally before you take on a really big story where you're getting lied to by professionals. You can figure things out in a local community, and you can. It's always been almost a cliche but it somehow evaporated. And so many emerging journalists, Alec, you probably see this if you go speak at Columbia School of Journalism, or you're at NYU or CUNY, or you go out to Northwestern, or you go to Berkeley. Almost everywhere in the country, this emerging generation of journalists, there's too much emphasis on wanting to do big national or big foreign. And for a while, there was this surge of freelancers going into war zones, which deep tragedy for me personally. Jim Foley, who I worked with, who I was proud to work with, who was my colleague. I was his editor on different occasions, both at Global Post and then at Ground Truth. And I thought the world of him. And as many of you know, he's the journalist who was captured by ISIS and killed. And that was a searing moment for us, where you have to tell not just the journalists who want to do national, but the journalists who want to do international. It doesn't matter where you want to start or where you want to end up, you have to start locally. And I try to tell journalists all the time that I covered the Middle East, but for me, it was a local story. I was the first reporter on the scene as a police reporter at the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993. I had a mullet. I was like out reporting like a New York Daily News cop reporter. And I loved my job, but it led me to trying to figure out who wanted to try to blow up the World Trade Center. Remember, they failed in 1993. Yeah. Only 6 people were killed. But it was the beginning of a story, so that by the time 9/11 hit, I had 8 years of reporting and trying to understand that. When I went to the Boston Globe, it became my job as Middle East bureau chief before 9/11. But it began, that whole journey as a Middle East correspondent, for me, began as a local story, a police story about who are these guys who tried to blow up the World Trade Center. We didn't know it then, but we know it now. It was nascent Al-Qaeda. And I think the best stories are the stories that begin locally and they build out. And this is why ProPublica can play such an important role in terms of seeding these really talented newsrooms that are operating locally to aspire to do great work. We've partnered with ProPublica. It's It's an amazing opportunity to think of this. There's so many different organizations in this space. You know, someone mentioned we should think about solutions, and I could not agree more. Like, solutions journalism is so important. We partner with Solutions Journalism Network, which is an amazing organization that asks the journalists who are part of its training to think as hard about the solutions as you do about the problem, and to report as hard on both. And, you know, there's so many forces for good right now trying to work together. I think one of the challenges is going to be, how do we create a big tent that we can all come together and keep working together? Because we have to think about how we're going to do that. And I think there's a lot more we can do. And if I know we don't have too much time, Fred, but I did want to ask you a question, if I may. I wanted to just say, like, part of the journey has been recognizing that the nonprofit journalism, those approaches are going to become more and more important across the country. In local journalism, public radio is so strong in our state, in Massachusetts, but across the country. And I just wanted to sort of learn a little bit about what your journey has told you about the role that nonprofit journalism can play in the future.
Well, clearly, for us, philanthropy is going to be a part of what's going to keep our organization moving forward and growing in the future. We've investigated becoming a nonprofit. It's certainly not something that I want to do. Not because I think there's value in for-profit companies. Because I've experienced myself situations where people sort of perform for the grant. I don't want to become a performer for grant givers,
Right.
And so that's scary, a little bit scary. But we've been working with Berkshire Taconic. We've got some plans down in the future that I don't want to announce on this right now. But we're going to bring philanthropy into our organization because it seems to be what's happening all over the country. I have one last question for you guys, and this is using the chair's prerogative because it cuts close to where we're at. Someone wrote in, do local newspaper editorials contribute to the divide, given that many people do not distinguish news from editorial comments? Then can you imagine newspapers without editorials? And, I get this a lot because people, whenever I go out in the street to talk, people say, oh, I read your paper, but you're too left wing. They don't use that term, but that's what they mean. We're all a bunch of communists. And I try to distinguish between the news pages, the front page, and the local page from the editorial page, and then the editorials from the op-eds. But it doesn't work. People believe that we're all, that we're very, very far to the left, even though we're not, at least in my estimation. So I'm just curious what you think about this. Alec, you've got some real connection to this situation.
Yeah, I'm pretty biased on this one. I'm a big believer in local editorials, and I mean, okay. I think they're such an important, a well-done local editorial that is speaking to a really important local state issue that's been reported, that's well written, that helps readers think about how to think about something that they're kind of worried about but haven't thought about too much. I think it's such an important element of the package, and something that, I mean, I know, and this is not just from my bias from having my father be the editorial page editor for years at the Eagle. It's also here at the Baltimore Sun. There was a whole stretch in recent years where under a certain editorial page editor, editorials that were so well done that I found that I was often learning more from them even than I was from the news pages, and because they'd really taken the time and thought about it hard and pulled it all together with a little bit of voice, a little bit of edge. And so I believe that the best way to deal with people worrying about bias, or people feeling like that it's just all the media or the liberal media, whatever, is that for them to meet that reporter who's come to their door because they're dealing with some issue, whether it's, say, the bridge that's been, it's down to one lane outside their house and there's horrible traffic, and when is that damn bridge going to get fixed? and Judy comes to your house and asks serious questions about it and writes a serious article about it. That does so much right there to deal with worries about the damn liberal media, because you actually saw the media in the flesh and they did their job.
Well said.
I think it's time for Peter Taylor to wrap this up. Charlie, I would thank you. I don't mean to cut you off, but
No, that was a beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful note to think about. Local opinion writers have such a role to play, and I really admire your hybrid model, Fred, where you're thinking about philanthropy, you're keeping the revenue streams open, and one of the dangers of nonprofit is you can't have an opinion page, and I think that's a weakness of the model. So I think we're going to have to be creative. I love the way you're doing it. The key, I think, is for people to recognize the incredible value of a local newspaper of the caliber of the Berkshire Eagle. It is a treasure, and really, I applaud you and I admire the leadership you're bringing to it.
very, very kind. Thank you so much. Peter.
Thank you, Fred and Alec and Charlie, for such a lively and provocative conversation that just underscored the critical importance of local journalism for an informed citizenry and strong communities and a vibrant democracy. It's just a great conversation. So thank you very much. Our fourth of this speaker series is next Tuesday, and it's going to focus in on what does bridging divides and healing communities look like on the local level. It's going to feature 4 panelists who will bring stories and experiences of what it takes to bring residents together to build community and trust in relationships through arts and the creative process, and also creating conditions for difficult conversations to occur on critical community issues. It's going to be moderated by Suzette Masters, who is a national expert on civic engagement and immigration, and also a board member of Berkshire Taconic Community Foundation. So it promises to be a conversation just like we had tonight on important issues with informed speakers. I hope you can attend. I want to conclude tonight by thanking our partners at the Berkshire Eagle, for Fred Rutberg, and our partner at Berkshire Bank and Lori Kiley, for making this speaker series possible. And I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Good evening, and look forward to seeing you next week for our final part of this series. Good night.
Thank you, Charlie. Good night.
Good night.
Right.